Good morning. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Libby Saunier, and I'm the Executive Director of the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children. As an independent source of data, research, and pertinent information for policymakers, the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children works to advance policies that ensure Louisiana's young children have success and access to high-quality early care and education. We partnered with the Kathleen Babineau Blanco Public Policy Center and the B.I. Moody III College of Business at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette to release a new report, Local Taxation in Louisiana, Alternatives for Local Public Support for Childcare. This report highlights different methods local governments can use to leverage their power of taxation to meet childcare needs in their communities. With Louisiana spending less than 0.5% of state dollars on early care and education, opportunities for local investments are especially important right now. There is room for us to truly make children our priority, and cities and parishes in Louisiana can step up to this challenge through strategies outlined in this report. To quote Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman, the best investment in quality early childhood development from birth to 5 for disadvantaged children and their families. Heckman found that investing in early care and education yields a 13% return on investment. Investing in young children results in direct returns for state and communities. In other words, the more we invest in young children now, the more we all benefit tomorrow. Children who have access to high-quality early learning are more likely to graduate from high school, continue higher education, and have higher earning abilities. They are also less likely to be involved in the juvenile justice or criminal justice systems later in life. Data from our organization and the Blanco Center has also found that employees' absences and turnover due to child care issues cost Louisiana employers over $750 million a year, causing a $1.3 billion loss annually for our economy. There are currently over 147,000 children under age 4 who are in need of high quality early care and education, with nearly 120,000 of those children still unserved. Earlier this year, the Louisiana Early Childhood Care and Education Commission recommended that the state of Louisiana annually invest $115 million in new funding over the next decade to ensure all in-need children have access to early care and education. In 2021, the Commission found that if Louisiana doesn't make this investment, in 10 years, our state will experience a collective loss of $12.1 billion. The need for solutions to invest in high-quality early care and education is imperative. And I'm thrilled you all can be here today to hear more about taxation options that local communities have to raise investments for high-quality childcare, as well as one example of a parish who successfully raised new revenue for early care and education. At this time, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Stephen Barnes, Director of the Kathleen Blanco Public Policy Center at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette.
Thank you, Libby, and it's a pleasure to be here today and share some highlights from the report that we are releasing today. If we could move forward, we'll jump right in. So the goals of this study were organized around an understanding that of increased public interest in finding new solutions to expand access to childcare and early education. And given the complexity of the local tax environment in Louisiana, we felt it was important to review that as thoroughly as we could and offer an accessible yet detailed summary of key statutory and constitutional provisions that enable and govern local taxation, as well as an introduction and summary of the provisions that create or authorize the creation of local governmental subdivisions. So that's an understanding of what the rules are today and what options might already exist to create new structures. We've also summarized existing local taxing capacity to give local advocates and stakeholders an understanding of the starting point for thinking about what might come next, and highlighting approaches where local revenue could be generated to fund childcare activities. We can move forward. So, as may not come as a surprise, most people have a good bit of familiarity with sales taxes and property taxes. Those two specific tax types form the basis of local government in Louisiana. There are some other tax types used in other areas, in other states by local government, but the Louisiana Constitution prohibits many of those other sources of tax revenue, including explicit prohibitions against income tax, severance tax, and some others. And so, as it stands today, the majority of local revenues do come from taxes and intergovernmental transfers. And so we've got some data in the report to give people an understanding of what that looks like. Those intergovernmental transfers include state and local revenues that flow through, state and federal revenues that flow through local governments to help support some of the local services. But that local taxation piece is really the primary thing that local governments have control over and that local governments turn to when there's a need for additional revenue. We could advance to the next slide. As by way of introduction and kind of orientation to what these different tax types look like in Louisiana and some other benchmark states, as well as the far right there in national averages, we can see that in most places, the property and sales taxes make up the largest sources of revenue. Nationally, we can see that income taxes and even corporate taxes, as well as some other tax types, are making a contribution to local revenues. But the pattern in Louisiana looks quite different than the nation as a whole, with a much larger contribution from sales taxes to the total set of local revenues. The picture is somewhat similar in Alabama and Arkansas, but it's worth noting that those three states really stand out as distinct and different, taking a very different strategy from virtually every other state in terms of relying so heavily on sales taxes. In fact, those are the only three states in the country where local governments generate more revenue from sales taxes than they do from property taxes. Also worth noting that some of while Arkansas has a similar distribution to Louisiana, other neighboring states in Mississippi and Texas, as you can see here, rely much more heavily on property taxes in terms of thinking about our starting point. If we can advance to the next slide. Other kind of important foundational things related to sales taxes at a local level is an appreciation of just how complex our current local sales tax system is. The graphic on the right here is sort of a hypothetical illustration of the different types of taxes and how they can overlap with one another. So even within a certain parish, there are going to be multiple different taxing entities levying taxes, and those taxing entities or districts are oftentimes defined in ways so that geographically they don't all overlap with each other. So even within a parish, we might have certain locations facing one set of taxes and other locations in that parish facing slightly different sets of taxes. And so we talk a little bit more about that in the report to give readers a better understanding of the current complexity, what that mix looks like, and how we might think about that both as potential barriers and obstacles as we think about developing new systems, but also perhaps there's some strategy there that we can use, recognizing that the boundaries of a taxing district can be created to serve a specific need. We can advance to the next slide. Another important consideration that we talk about in the report is thinking about who is paying those taxes. Obviously, if the desire to support childcare and early education is focused on helping, say, low-income families, well, we'd want to think about who is paying those taxes. And if we've designed a system intended to help a certain group of families, are we taxing them in a way that fully undermines that, or perhaps in a way that's appropriate given those overall goals? And so the tax type is known to have a pretty big influence on the distribution of who is paying. And as we look at the graphic here on the right, we can see that sales and excise taxes in green are more heavily tilted towards lower income individuals and families, where the effective rate or the tax burden that family feels is higher at lower income levels, which we typically think of as being a regressive tax. Property taxes are also somewhat tilted in that direction. In Louisiana, we know we do have a homestead exemption, which we think of as offering great relief for lower income families, and to some extent it does. However, when we think about the broader impacts in terms of rental properties and so on, those homestead exemptions don't offer universal relief for lower income families, and are really tied more specifically to the value of a property, making it not as clearly targeted of a program or source of tax relief. And then, of course, not on the table currently for local taxation, but when we think about broadly different types of taxes, income taxes tend to be more tilted towards higher income earners and therefore considered more progressive. We could advance to the next slide. So beyond sort of the general background information that we offer regarding different types of taxes, how to think about those things, and considerations related to who's paying those taxes, we offer a good bit of detail about the primary local tax revenues in Louisiana, starting first with sales taxes. In Louisiana, as we saw in that chart earlier, more than half of local government tax revenue comes from sales taxes. And again, thinking about the current complexity of sales taxation in Louisiana, we have over 400 distinct sales tax districts in the state. In the context of weighing the potential for introducing a new tax, that's something that potentially offers significant political barriers. There has been a lot of effort in recent years to try to simplify the state sales tax system, especially at the local level. However, the 400 sales tax districts is also a reflection of the fact that we have, as a state, historically been open to creating targeted districts for targeted purposes here, and have a very large number to this point. And those sales taxes provide revenues funding school boards, roadway improvements, law enforcement, general funds, and several other types of local services. We could advance to the next slide. Another important piece of backdrop, which I've kind of alluded to already, is the state's current heavy reliance on sales taxes. And when we combine state and local sales taxes, as many of you may be familiar, we often see headlines and sort of negative narratives in the press and the media when we think about taxation, with Louisiana standing out as having the highest combined rate of state and local sales taxes. So again, a recognition of our current dependence on this source of revenue, as well as potential concerns for pushing that even further. It is worth noting that this relates to the nominal rate. So the number that we see written in the law. Louisiana also has a very large number of exemptions and exclusions. That means large categories of spending are not subject to the sales tax. So at the end of the day, we're not really generating as much revenue from sales taxes as these kinds of numbers or rankings would suggest, but in fact have a structure that perhaps loses us points in the media and in terms of public perception, without necessarily creating the compensatory or associated level of revenues from that. So we've got a complex system that's not generating quite as much output, given the sort of rates and the perception that our structure creates on its surface. We could advance to the next slide. So to sum up some of the considerations, thinking through how sales taxes could be used to support early care and education. Currently, many jurisdictions are already at or even above the general limit on sales tax rates. So the state has a general cap on what can be taxed. There are numerous, the tax rate, there are numerous exemptions or exceptions that have been advanced, and those things require legislative action. So could there potentially be additional exceptions introduced? Certainly, but an alternative might be looking at a special tax district, which could allow room for more revenue. So rather than trying to increase the amount of tax that an existing taxing authority would charge, adding an additional taxing authority with some special taxing district might be an easier path forward. In terms of burden and progressivity, as I mentioned earlier, sales taxes have a disproportionate effect on low-income residents, so something certainly to keep in mind. Again, I've referenced the large number of exemptions and exclusions. And so related to this, another possibility might be considering changing what some of those exemptions and exclusions look like as a way of generating additional revenue within the existing rate structure. Finally, with regard to reliability, the sales tax base does provide a predictable revenue stream that tends not to vary too much from year to year, though lower collections certainly are seen in times of poor economic health. Overall, sales taxes do keep pace with inflation. All right, if we can advance to the next slide, I'll offer a brief summary of the local property tax information that we have in the report. Thinking big picture about local property taxes as part of the Louisiana local tax system, property taxes make up about 40% of local tax revenues in Louisiana and provide funding for general as well as specific services. And on the right-hand side here, we see the distribution of the local property taxes by source or by service. So we've got, for example, general parish property taxes making up about 40% of taxes levied and collected, and schools making up about 38%, with a range of other smaller targeted taxes for specific purposes. And again, providing a little bit more of an introduction to the tax type in the report, it is important to think about the different components of what generates the revenue. So property taxes are based on an assessment rate that's defined by a property type, whether that's residential or other type of property, an assessed value, as well as the millage rate, which is really effectively the tax rate. And so when you think about a certain local area, you might have concerns about the property tax base. But when digging in and thinking more carefully about the types of property in that area, whether there might be commercial or industrial property that is a little, maybe just outside of your frame of reference, and looking more holistically at a local area or even a broader region, it's important to be thinking about the type of property as well as the assessed values of those properties alongside any discussion about the rate and what revenues those might generate. Okay, if we could advance to the next slide. Big picture backdrop, thinking about kind of the state of the world today. The median property tax payment by state is presented here on the left-hand side. And we see Louisiana with a lighter shading here at the lower end of the spectrum. Specific highlights when we look at some of the highest tax states, several in the Northeast there go up to the top of that list. States with the lowest tax payment, we see Louisiana as one of the lowest in terms of property taxes. And our neighbor just to the west in Texas, clearly shaded at a much higher or a much darker shade there relative to Louisiana, has a distinctly different strategy with a much greater reliance on property taxes than has Louisiana. I think we're notable difference when we think about a lot of discussions about comparisons between Louisiana's tax environment and Texas. All right, if we could advance to the next slide. Summary of some of the big takeaways on property taxes. Again, the tax base depends on the mix of property types as well as the assessed values. In terms of burden and progressivity, it is less regressive than the sales tax, though perhaps not quite as favorable for lower income families as one might expect, given the knowledge of the homestead exemption in Louisiana. And it's also worth keeping in mind that the tax incidence, or who ultimately pays for that, for any commercial millages, may ultimately be passed down to customers or have other economic effects. So also, if you think about trying to be too careful and targeted in how you would say, draw the boundaries of a taxing district or target taxes in a certain geographic area, it's important to keep in mind the broader implications. So if you've got locally owned restaurants in an area facing higher taxes, ultimately they're going to have to cover those costs by passing on higher prices to customers. In terms of reliability, property values fluctuate much less than do sales and appreciate reliably over time. With an existing millage rate kind of on the books, property values are reassessed over time, but the current the Constitution requires local taxing authorities to decrease the rate when the assessed value has been increased as a default approach to managing those millages over time. However, local taxing authorities do have the authority to roll forward that millage and essentially hold the rate the same, and which ultimately means generating more revenue if property values are reassessed and increased by the local assessor. That allows tax authorities to generate more revenue as values rise, and could be a mechanism if we're, again, thinking about the long-term viability of relying on property taxes for something like early care and education. If the rate of increases in property values, or I should say, if the increased cost of operating those kinds of facilities is going up over time at a rate that is putting pressure on the system, that might be a mechanism for local authority to try to sustain a level of revenue that can provide those services. But important to keep in mind, there's a long adjustment times between appraisal cycles. So plans for managing those dollars might need to include a combination of covering operational expenses with some other more flexible expenses from year to year that could be scaled up and down given how what the operational needs might be. Okay, if we can advance to the next slide. So without getting into any of these in detail, I'll just mention that we also spend some time discussing some other structures and methods that could be used to support early care and education at the local level. Several of these are really more oriented around generating one-time funds or perhaps bringing future years of revenue forwards in order to generate larger upfront investments. But special taxing districts are something that we spend some time talking about. I've touched on that already a couple of times, which gives local governments a little more flexibility in thinking about what is the area that we're really looking to serve here, and where is the tax base that we might be able to turn to support that type of service. So much more discussion about that in the report. But happy to have had a chance to give all of you an introduction to this today, and excited to have the report out there publicly for all of you to have a chance to dig in and explore. We can advance to the next slide. So having said that, it is my pleasure now to turn the presentation over to Sharonda Williams to talk more about what is happening in New Orleans.
Thank you, Stephen. I'm excited to be here. So one of the things you just heard Stephen talk about was using local property taxes as a strategy to generate new revenue for high quality early care and education. Earlier this year, New Orleans successfully did this, and I'm here to share more about how our coalition, Ready Kids NOLA, made that happen. This past spring, voters approved a property tax measure, again also known as a millage, which will create 1,000 or more early childhood seats for low-income children every year for 20 years. The money will also expand the supply of quality early learning centers and fund child and family support services and coaching and professional development for teachers. A millage or a millage rate, as Stephen just said, is a tax rate that applies in the calculation of a specific property tax levy. When a property tax proposition is put before the voters, it will be for a certain millage rate and for a certain period of time. The New Orleans Early Care and Education millage will raise about $21 million in its first year. For a family with a home valued at $420,000, this translates to an annual tax increase of about $172.50. Or as we commonly said during the campaign, for a home valued at $200,000, translates to about a cup of coffee per month. We did this using multiple strategies that really focused on building support within the community. Our campaign, which already had a broad coalition of support from the New Orleans Campaign for Grade Level Reading, as well as from the mayor and the New Orleans City Council, polled voters and found that there were strong levels of support in New Orleans for both small and relatively larger tax increases to fund early childhood education. As we put our proposal together, we spent time with community partners and providers to refine the proposal and build support for it to gain their buy-in. Several community groups, policy organizations, service providers, city councilmen, state and federal legislators, and the mayor endorsed the millage. We also won the support of large employers and popular business leaders, including the Business Council of New Orleans and the River Region, and the New Orleans Chamber of Commerce, helping to dissuade any well-funded anti-tax opposition from emerging. And finally, as you can see from the slide, on April 30th, 2022, the years of hard work paid off as the early education property tax measure passed overwhelmingly, 61% to 39%. I am so proud to share that New Orleans is now part of a growing number of cities and states across the country, which have used property taxes to fund high-quality early childcare and education. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Libby for closing remarks and questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Sharonda. The New Orleans Early Care and Education Millage was truly a historic moment for early care and education in Louisiana, and we appreciate you sharing more about what made that possible. Local property taxes are a strong option for investing local dollars in high-quality early care and education. Right now, the state of Louisiana has a state fund called the Louisiana Early Childhood Education Fund that offers local entities, including cities and parishes, a dollar-for-dollar match on local investments made to expand access to quality early care and education for children who need it most. As of November the 1st, the Louisiana Early Childhood Education Fund has over $48 million that local communities can draw down from. Currently, East Baton Rouge Parish is exploring local funding options, and a recent poll found that 60% of East Baton Rouge voters agreed that doubling the number of early childhood seats in the parish is a good, even excellent use of public funding, and that these voters would be willing to pay more taxes to make that happen. While there is no one-size-fits-all approach for generating revenue at the local level, we urge local leaders in Louisiana to consider which approaches may be best given the jurisdiction's tax base, its administrative capacity, how a tax could impact residents, and the different methods for creating and structuring taxing districts. This past year, during the 2022 legislative session, state lawmakers made a historic down payment on our future by allocating $84 million in new funding for early care and education. However, in 2024, Louisiana is set to run out of a significant amount of one-time federal stimulus dollars. Without further reoccurring investment, too many Louisiana families will not have access to affordable quality childcare. Therefore, local investments in early care and education are very important to close this funding gap in order to provide affordable, high-quality childcare for children and families in Louisiana. Now we're going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. Please type in your questions in the chat. We know that was a lot of information shared with you all in a very condensed format. And so we just want to let you know that you can reach out to us or to Dr. Stephen Barnes related to questions related to the policy paper that we did together. Before we close, I want to extend one final thank you to all of our partners. Oh, wait, we got a question. Cindy Bishop asked, how would something like this work for small rural cities like Bogalusa? Stephen, I think you might have to answer that one for us.
Yep, I'm getting myself unmuted. So obviously the coordination challenge in a more rural area is difficult. It's difficult in part because you don't have the high density development that supports the larger tax base or provides a larger tax base, but it's also challenging because the population that you might be looking to serve is going to be more dispersed. So there is not an easy solution to that. And I will acknowledge that the report that we're releasing today is intended to provide a really valuable resource in terms of thinking about local taxation as a tool here. But it won't be the full playbook on how to solve all those problems. Having said that, we're happy to engage in additional discussion. The biggest thing that I would emphasize, though, in terms of how to maybe get creative in thinking about local taxation is recognizing that it certainly could be done in a more flexible way geographically, even across parish boundaries. And I'll offer up the levy districts as just a reference there, designed with a completely different purpose, but many of those levy districts span multiple parishes. And in fact, in many cases, cover only portions of certain parishes. So, again, this isn't going to be a one size fits all solution for a rural community, but could there be a combination of 2 or 3 nearby communities, either within a parish or even across parish boundaries, that might be able to pool together to generate a system that serves those communities with shared funds and a shared solution? I think that would be kind of the direction I would recommend.
Thanks, Stephen. And that was from Jennifer Kelsey. She's a childcare owner of Garden of Knowledge in Bogalusa. So thank you for that. And then James Franklin asked, how will these funds be disseminated to centers? The allocation of dissemination to centers would go through the local community, early childhood community network. And that becomes increasingly important as those networks are really invested in the community and know where the type 3 centers who would be eligible to receive such funding. So that's how the funding would be disseminated. Sharonda, we got a question for you. What are some lessons that other local communities can learn from New Orleans if they decide to do a property tax?
Well, I think I said a moment ago, it was like years long of work that led to this, so that this was not the first attempt. And so we spent a lot of time strategizing and even engaging a political consultant to assist us with proper outreach to get all of the players at the table, which is something that I said a moment ago. And then it was really working out the logistics and the question about dissemination to the centers. We spent a lot of time drafting a cooperative endeavor agreement with the city, who would, of course, receive all the tax dollars, but how that money would be distributed and what entities would be involved in that distribution. So we spent a lot of time talking through logistics with Agenda for Children and the Orleans Parish School Board to determine how we were going to manage all the logistics of it. So it was multiple things happening at once with different people involved in different spaces.
Thank you so much, Rhonda. Anybody else have any other questions? Give you a minute just in case you're typing.
While we're waiting, I'll jump in and offer a little bit of a link from what we just heard about efforts in New Orleans back to the question of challenges in a more rural area like Bogalusa. And again, when we think about the population served, talk to the business community, because there might be some commercial areas or even 1 or 2 larger industrial sites where the childcare service is actually critical to supporting their workforce. And even if you don't think that your city or region has the property tax base, when you look, you think about that broadly from home values or what you visually see when you're driving around along sides of the road, if you can look at that map and think about how to pull together that collection of business interests with enough general support, there might be an opening there.
And Stephen, to your point, in New Orleans, that was one of the things that helped us in our conversations with business leaders in terms of how it affects their workforce. If we have a lot of single mothers who need spaces for their children to go, and how that impacts workers being at work and having the ability to be at work continuously and on a regular basis, but also just long-term in terms of the social benefits of having children who are educated early on and how that impacts us on a long-term basis.
Thank y'all both for that. We also got a question about what are the different ways that polls have been implemented. Teresa, do you mean polls where you poll likely voters, or do you mean, I'm not sure what you mean. I just want to make sure I clarify. Oh, about polls with voters. So in the process, as you start to discuss in your community, we want to do something like this. What do you think the voters are thinking? And so this is one of the things that happened in New Orleans early on, to see if there was a millage, if we were going to, do something different to really generate revenue for early care and education. How do likely voters feel about that? I know at the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children, we did our first poll related to sin taxes, thinking about sports betting and some of those revenues going towards early care and education in 2019. We repolled in 2021 related to a series of sin taxes, which are like if recreational marijuana, alcohol, those types of things. If people would support taxation on those to support early care and education. And that's helped us make the case to our elected officials of why investment in early care and education is important, and that their voters would support that. And then in New Orleans and in other places is just a general to see what's the base of people and how they would support early care and education. It gives you a temperature of what you could do. You can also poll different millage rates to see what people's tolerance is for a millage rate on a property tax, or if you're going to do a special taxing district like that. Great questions, y'all. And then Hamilton Simons Jones shared that in New Orleans, the polls did a few key things. One is test the amount of tax, like I just said, test what messaging was effective to persuade voters to support, as well as to identify what types of voter supports oppose or undecided to inform our strategic approach. We found that early polling was also very important to get elected officials on board when they saw how much support there was for it. So it's really like a wraparound messaging and making sure that you can garner the support that you would need. Well, thank you all so much for this. Before we close, I really do want to extend a final thank you to all of our partners who made this report possible. I know we at the Louisiana Policy Institute for Children are incredibly grateful to Dr. Stephen Barnes and his team, as well as to Chase with the business school at ULL. We couldn't have done any of this dreaming and thinking about what's possible for revenue sources for our young children in the state. You can view the report. To view it, you can visit the Blanco Policy Center. We will also send out a press release after this finishes with a recording of this press conference with the report and a link to the report. And again, thank you for everyone for joining us today. I echo the sentiments of all the speakers and share my gratitude and really our gratitude for your participation and interest and support, and how we increase investment in early care and education in our state, because we know at the end of the day that a successful Louisiana starts with successful children. Thank you all.